Today we'll be talking about Chapter 18, Section 4, and the title of this is America as a World Power. We'll be looking briefly at a war between Russia and Japan. You could call this even the opening shots of the Pacific theater of the Second World War. This was really Japan's first aggressive actions in the Pacific, which would continue throughout the 1930s and 40s. We'll be talking about the construction of the Panama Canal, as well as the Mexican Revolution. And I've got a ton of different Mexican leaders and revolutionaries and even some banditos to tell you about today. And then finally, we'll be talking about how all of these things influenced America's military and economic power.
Still not working.
Okay, so first off, let's talk about Teddy Roosevelt in this context. We've learned about him and his domestic agenda with the Square Deal. And so now we're going to be talking about Roosevelt and his agenda as president in terms of foreign policy. Teddy Roosevelt did not want Europeans to have influence in the Western Hemisphere. He did not want Europeans loaning South and Central American countries money and gaining influence in these regions. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt wanted the United States to be the leading player in global politics. And he showed this intention in 1904 when he negotiated an end to a war between Japan and Russia. This was the beginning of what some believe to be Japan's 1,000-year plan to conquer the world. It began with gaining control of East Asia. And this began with Manchuria, which would give them control to a wealthy economic sector, as well as Korea. And so Japan and Russia had been disputing these territories, and then when Roosevelt negotiated the Treaty of Portsmouth, Japan was winning this war, but they had approached Teddy Roosevelt and asked him to broker a peace agreement because they understood they could not continue to fight the war at the scale that they had been doing. They needed to take time to regroup, to retrench, and to prepare for the coming larger campaign of conquering China and Indonesia and the Philippines and even Australia, and some believe they had their sights set on the United States even. And so they needed to make peace with Russia. Now Roosevelt, meanwhile, had his day in the spotlight. He became the first American president to win the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating this peace agreement. The United States and Japan, meanwhile, continued diplomatic talks, pledged to respect each other's possessions, and generally had a good diplomatic relationship until the 1930s when China began to act aggressively in Southeast Asia, particularly in Indochina. But we'll get to that later. The next example I'd like to talk about is the Panama Canal. The most narrow strip of land connecting North and South America, dividing the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean, is the Isthmus of Panama. It's a tiny little stretch of land. In fact, if you're on a high point, you can see both oceans, either side of the Panama Canal. So it makes perfect sense to build a shortcut here, because U.S. shipping was having to go all the way around the coast of South America to trade with the Indies and China, and any Pacific trade had to go all the way around the hemisphere. And so it made perfect sense to dig this canal. Yet construction of the canal proved to be very expensive because Panama is in a tropical region. It is also in a politically unstable region. The project was originally undertaken by a French company who negotiated with the country of Colombia to build the Panama Canal. But when talks broke down and Colombia proved difficult, this French company actually helped to organize of Panamanian Revolution. You see, Panama was originally part of the country of Colombia. And I don't know the exact details here, if Colombia wanted more money or if they were just being difficult. In fact, they are a very corrupt country in themselves, dating back even before the drug wars. And so I don't know the details, but nonetheless, this French company was so committed to completing the Panama Canal project, they organized the area's separation from the country of Colombia with the aid of military help from the United States. Because the United States had a vested interest in seeing this construction project completed. In fact, we wound up purchasing the project from this French company, and we paid $10 million, which was an enormous sum at this time, for the Canal Zone. This is what the canal looks like today. Again, from a high point, you can see both oceans. This is considered one of the greatest engineering feats in American history for several reasons that we'll explore. Number one side of the isthmus is at a higher elevation than the other, meaning that ships would actually have to go uphill and then downhill. So they had to cross a mountain range. So this was accomplished through the use of levees. However, digging this ditch, as I said, is one of the greatest engineering feats of our country's history. At its height, 43,400 workers were employed. You know, think of it on the scale of building the Great Pyramids. That's the type of engineering marvel that is the Panama Canal. Thousands died of diseases. Geographic obstacles, political obstacles, nothing was going to stop the United States from building this canal. And it still serves today as one of the world's greatest shortcuts. It was such a large canal that until the second half of the 20th century, it could fit our largest ships. Aircraft carriers won't fit through, they have to go around, but most of our shipping can go through the Panama Canal even today. Meanwhile, Teddy Roosevelt feared European intervention, primarily through finances. If these young, new South American nations defaulted on their loans, then the European banks that had loaned them money and that held their debts might intervene. And so Roosevelt held true to the Monroe Doctrine when he demanded that European countries stay out of Latin American countries. And he called this the Roosevelt Corollary. He said that if necessary, we would use force to protect our economic interests in the Western world. However, more often, we exercised our influence through money. This was called dollar diplomacy. And it's still very much a part of U.S. foreign policy. Countries that we are allied closely with receive large sums of money from the United States every year. We do this for several reasons. Number one, we want to ensure the safety and security and prosperity of our allies. But did you know that the nation of Israel receives half of all U.S. foreign aid? All the money we give to all the countries around the world, Israel gets half of it. And most of that is in the form of weapons. So this dollar diplomacy buys us a lot of influence, and it buys us a lot of power. And we hold large shares of debt for many foreign countries, in particular many of those in South America that were new countries in 1900. And if they had defaulted on their loans, then these European countries would have had a great deal of power over them. So I just want to show you a couple of old political cartoons. Teddy Roosevelt earned himself quite the reputation around the world as playing the world's policeman with his new diplomacy. He had it.
Could you go back? Okay, thank you.
he had an old phrase: speak softly and carry a big stick. And this next cartoon I'll show you in just a moment. It shows him sitting atop the world with his big stick. And by speak softly and carry a big stick, dollar diplomacy mandates that you buy influence when you can, but that you take it when you must. And then the final cartoon shows Roosevelt, and I really like his capris here and his knickers. He's just very stylish with his ascot and, you know, his little twirly mustache. He's just a very fashionable man of the era, if you will. But you see him traipsing barefoot through the Caribbean with his giant navy. On to Woodrow Wilson. We'll be learning a great deal about Woodrow Wilson in the coming days of the First World War. Wilson's background: from a strict Puritan family, as the president of Princeton University, and then, of course, governor of New Jersey, and then finally president of the United States. This man believed that the United States had a moral responsibility in the world, that we had to be the good guys. And I have strong evidence to believe that he truly believed what he said when he announced U.S. war in Europe by making the world, quote, safe for democracy. And he really lived to that. His policies were based on that. He called it the Missionary Diplomacy. And he said that the United States would not recognize any regime of any country that was oppressive or undemocratic. But of course, our closest neighbor to the south, Mexico, as a new country, had just a few decades prior to Wilson's inauguration as president lost half its territory to the United States in the U.S. war with Mexico. And the president of the time had lost power due to the disgrace of that defeat and had been replaced by a series of leaders who ruled for short periods of time. And the leader, the dictator who was ruling at the time of Wilson's presidency, was named Porfirio Diaz. But even under the dictator Diaz, when Wilson was inaugurated, the United States had invested heavily in Mexico. We had American factories there, yes, even before NAFTA. We had loaned money to Mexico in large sums. And so we had a close trading relationship with Mexico. In 1911, Diaz was overthrown by a popular leader named Francisco Madero. And this revolutionary was actually overthrown again by a general, a leader of the military, Victoriano Huerta. And Huerta took over the government and had Madero murdered. And so meanwhile, this is bad business. To go from a dictator to a popular revolutionary, then the revolutionary is murdered and a leader of the military is now dictator. This is a very unstable time for Mexico. And so as such, Wilson refused to recognize the general's government. And when a country refuses to recognize another, it's very bad for business. For example, we refused to recognize Castro's Cuba for over 50 years. That means we had no diplomatic relations. We had no foreign ambassadors in their country. They had no foreign ambassadors in our country. We weren't allowed to visit Cuba. We didn't like them. Any act of aggression could be seen as an act of war. It's a very tense situation diplomatically. In fact, if you're aware of Cuba's history, we did try to invade them once. We surrounded their entire island in the 1960s. So a very tense situation. And we were in the same diplomatic space with Mexico at this time.
There is a saying, a very old saying, when the pupil is ready, the master will appear.
Zorro.
In a land where freedom is a memory.
I came here to learn how to fight like you, to have your strength, your courage.
Zorro was a servant of the people. He did what was needed.
Now he's needed again.
And justice is outlawed.
That's the man who killed my brother.
The just must become outlaws.
Do you know how to use that thing?
Yes. The pointy end goes into the other man.
This is going to take a lot of work.
1, 5, 3.
If you want to kill this man, I can help you, and I can teach you how to move, how to think, how to take your revenge with honor.
How can I do what is needed when all I feel is hate?
You hide it with this.
Be careful, señorita. There are dangerous men about.
Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. It has been 3 days since my last confession.
Go on.
I have broken the fourth commandment, Padre.
You kill somebody?
No, that is not the fourth commandment.
Of course not.
I had impure thoughts about a man.
Last four?
Yes, last one. No bad?
The only sin would be to deny what your heart truly feels. Not bad at all.
Now, between the woman who rules his heart
Don't pretend she means nothing to you.
But she does.
and the enemy who claims his soul
I would murder 100 innocent men if it meant killing you.
lies the battle
Montero has some plans for California.
The time has come to claim what always should have been ours.
for the destiny of a nation.
Tomorrow we fight in earnest. We will both tempt our fates.
It's only one man. It isn't just one man, damn it. It's Zorro.
This summer, justice leaves its mark.
You know, Zorro, he could be anywhere. Did you miss me?
Foreign policy at the turn of the century was characterized by three vastly different philosophies: Theodore Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy, William Taft's dollar diplomacy, and Woodrow Wilson's moral diplomacy. Theodore Roosevelt abided by the African proverb, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." He applied this big stick theory to American foreign policy, believing the U.S. should take a strong role in Asia. In 1905, Roosevelt intervened to end the war between Russia and Japan over Korea and Manchuria. When Japan was angered by racist sentiment in the U.S., Roosevelt arranged a gentleman's agreement. He would see that Asian discrimination ended, but in turn, Japan would have to limit Japanese immigration to the U.S. In a show of growing U.S. naval might, Roosevelt launched 16 warships on a world tour. Painted brilliant white, the flotilla was known as the Great White Fleet. The tour was a triumph. The U.S. was regarded as the most potent naval power after the British. In the interest of connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, Roosevelt turned his attention to a narrow strip of land in Colombia, the Isthmus of Panama. In 1903, Roosevelt's Secretary of State John Hay failed in an attempt to negotiate a treaty with Colombia for the land. But U.S. interests were not to be denied. Roosevelt backed a Panamanian revolt and negotiated for the Panama Canal Zone. Work began. Massive locks were designed to raise ships through the mountains and then lower them on the other side. 1.53 million cubic meters of concrete were poured, 70,000 workers recruited, and $400 million was spent. A marvelous engineering achievement, the canal was finally completed in 1914, just in time for World War I. In 1904, Roosevelt wielded his big stick again, adding a corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Initiated in 1823, the Monroe Doctrine established a policy to limit European expansion into the Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt's corollary went further. It stated that the U.S. had the right to intervene militarily to keep European powers out of the Western Hemisphere. The Roosevelt corollary was exercised the very next year in 1905 in order to relieve the Dominican Republic's debt to threatening foreign creditors. In 1909, when William Howard Taft succeeded Roosevelt as president, he established a foreign policy encouraging U.S. investment in Latin America and China as a way of discouraging European investment. In contrast to Roosevelt's big stick policy, this new policy became known as dollar diplomacy. As a result, U.S.-owned businesses came to dominate the economies of many small nations in Central America, the Caribbean, and parts of South America. Latin Americans reacted with anger and resentment, but they were powerless in the face of the U.S. military. In 1913, Woodrow Wilson succeeded Taft as president. Wilson offered yet another approach to foreign policy. He rejected big stick and dollar diplomacy in favor of a moral diplomacy, applying a moral standard and not recognizing any government that is undemocratic or hostile to U.S. interests. To protect U.S. business interests, Wilson rallied troops to stabilize Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Cuba, effectively turning them into U.S. protectorates. Wilson encountered failure in his dealings with Mexico. In the late 19th century, corruption in Mexico was prevalent, escalating with the assassination of Mexico's president, Francisco Madero, in 1913, and the assumption of power by Victoriano Huerta. Not wanting to support a government by murder, Wilson refused to dignify Huerta's government.
I am going to teach the South American republics to elect good men.
President Wilson mobilized U.S. Marines to capture the port of Veracruz in Mexico. Although split over allegiance to Huerta, Mexicans were united in their opposition to U.S. invasion, and war was barely averted between the two countries. In 1916, when Mexican rebel Pancho Villa raided a U.S. border town and killed U.S. citizens, an expeditionary force of 11,000 men, under the leadership of General John J. Pershing, crossed into Mexico to hunt for Villa. After a year-long pursuit, Pershing's expedition was called off, but the affair increased anti-American sentiments. U.S. troops withdrew in 1917, and tensions eventually eased between Mexico and the U.S.
Okay, so when the United States refused to recognize Huerta's regime, Huerta responded by having several American sailors stationed in Veracruz arrested. Though he quickly released them when President Wilson ordered the United States Marines to occupy the city of Veracruz. So this is certainly an act of war. So yes, we definitely went to war with Mexico in 1846, and we narrowly avoided war through the mediation of several other South American countries in the early 1900s, when we ordered the Marines to occupy one of Mexico's greatest port cities. Eventually, Huerta's regime collapsed, and a nationalist leader more friendly to the United States named Carranza was elected president. Now, Carranza had his share of enemies, most notably of which the famous Francisco Pancho Villa and his sidekick Emiliano Zapata. Both opposed Carranza's regime. They wanted land reform. They wanted more liberal ownership of land, so that the poor could acquire property of their own. Villa was a fierce nationalist, meaning that he wanted best for Mexico first. And he was willing to achieve his goals even through illegal means. Because Carranza labeled Pancho Villa an outlaw and had him and his gang hunted. And so Pancho Villa and his men were always on the run. Yet Carranza's regime was never able to find Pancho Villa. Though there was this ongoing war between these revolutionaries and the actual government. Meanwhile, Woodrow Wilson recognized Carranza's government in an attempt to rebuild the relationship between the United States and Mexico, and so that we could move forward with business. Villa, however, threatened reprisals even against the United States. And so like you saw in the video, Pancho Villa and his men raided a U.S. border town, kidnapped a number of Americans, and murdered them. In fact, I believe 8 different American engineers were captured and murdered. And so in response, which, by the way, here's a photograph of Pancho Villa, the man that we never caught. It's kind of a neat story. A&E did a biography on Pancho Villa. I love the subtext here. Is he an outlaw? Is he a hero? And it really depends on your perspective. Because while his goals were noble, again, he wanted to help the poor of Mexico. He wanted to get rid of the corrupt leaders there. But his methods were certainly questionable. So chasing Pancho Villa. As you saw in the video, we appointed one of our very best generals to hunt down this man. In fact, it would be John J. Pershing who would lead the American Expeditionary Force in the First World War. To send American troops into Mexico at this time was considered highly inappropriate when you think about the tense relations that we had with Mexico, that we had just occupied Veracruz just a few years prior. And so Carranza demanded the immediate withdrawal of American troops. But yet Pershing insisted 11,000 soldiers were hunting this man all through the country of Mexico. Wilson at first refused. However, due to the looming war in Europe that we will begin talking about soon, President Wilson decided that we needed peace in our southern border. Pershing was ordered home. Mexico was left to its own affairs. Meanwhile, Mexico adopted a constitution. And in this constitution, the government would control many of the means of production, such as the oil industry, the mining of minerals. There would be rules regarding the restriction of foreign investment in their country. But in 1920, Alvaro Obregón was elected the new president of Mexico, put an end to the Civil War, in fact, enacted many of the reforms that Pancho Villa and his troops were fighting for.